Hello and welcome to FunBikes TV. Today I'm going to explain how to build this, the FunBikes 49cc mini quad. All tools needed for this build are listed below in the video description. When you receive your FunBikes mini quad, it will arrive to you in a box like this. The first thing you will need to do is open the box and make sure all the contents are present and correct. When you are opening the box, please be careful because the box is stapled in and these can be sharp. Now that we've removed our packaging from our quad, we're going to open our contents box. In this you will find a handlebar pad, the front number board, the mixing bottle, bag of various nuts and bolts, your maintenance toolkit, your fuel cap breather pipe, your fuel cap, the front bullbar, your manual, and the information sheet that you must read before using the quad. The first part of the assembly we're going to do is to fit the handlebars and number boards. To start off with, we need to undo the cable tie that attaches the handlebars to the side of the vehicle and then remove the packaging from them. Place them over the top of the fuel tank to keep them out of the way. We have 4 clamps in our nuts and bolts bag. You'll see 2 of them are totally flat on the bottom and then 2 of them have slight notches cut into them. The ones that are flat on the bottom go on the bottom of the handlebars. The ones that have the notches cut in go onto the top of the handlebars. You will also find 2 small silver spacers that will go underneath the key barrel when we fit it to raise it up. Along with 4 bolts. In there, 2 of them are slightly longer than the other ones. These are all for attaching the handlebars to the quad. You will also need your front number board. To start off with, we're going to undo the bolt in the centre of our steering column using a 10 spanner or socket to allow us to fit the front number board. Place the bolt back through the number board and then put a small quantity of stud lock on the end of the threads to ensure that it doesn't come loose. Once we've placed a stud lock on the end of the threads, we can attach the number board to the quad, replacing the bolt where we removed it from. When we do this, make sure the number board is central and also tightened up fully. We are now ready to fit our key barrel and handlebars. Remove the key from the key barrel, lift your handlebars over the number board and then route the cables around to make sure they are nice and smooth with no kinks or sharp turns in them. Taking the flat handlebar clamp, place it underneath the handlebars and then take one of your clamps with the notches in and place it over the top. At this moment we're only going to fit the handlebars loosely using the shorter bolt, place it in the front towards the front wheels away from the fuel tank and tighten it up. Then take one of your longer bolts and the spacer, place the bolt through the key barrel and then place the spacer up against the bracket that holds the key barrel. Placing this into the rear hole in the handlebar clamps, making sure it is aligned and again only loosely fit it. This will help to hold the handlebars securely in position while you're attaching the other side properly. So take your other lower handlebar clamp, your bolts and your upper handlebar clamp. Make sure you use stud lock onto your bolts and place the clamps in the correct order as per the opposite side. Again, you will need to put your second spacer in underneath the key barrel when you put your longer bolt through. Then tighten up these 2 bolts, making sure that your handlebars are at equal distance between the front and rear bolts and at the same angle as the steering column. This ensures that the handlebars are in the correct position for the rider. There are also grooves cut into the handlebars. Make sure that they are central within the clamps and this ensures that the handlebars are square in the bike. Once we've tightened up the first side, we can remove the bolts we put in earlier and apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the bolts. We are now ready to finish tightening up our handlebars. Make sure that the gap between the clamps at the front and the rear is of an equal distance. We are now ready to fit our lower front shock absorber bolts. You may need to push the swing arm down to allow you to align them slightly because it's raised up for packaging within the box. Within your nut and bolts bag you will find there are 3 bolts of equal length with nuts with them. These are the shock absorber bolts. They can be quite awkward to align at first, okay, so you sometimes need to use the socket or spanner on the end of them to wiggle them into the correct position. It will be a 10 spanner and 13 spanner or sockets to tighten the front shock bolts up. And then place a small quantity of stud lock onto the end of the threads. Attach the nut that is provided onto the end of the nuts and tighten up fully. When we tighten the lower shock bolts, we must make sure that the gap in the frame at the bottom that they mount into is fully closed up onto the shock to prevent playing them. Repeat the same process with the opposite side. We are now ready to attach our front bull bar. To do this we will again need a 10 socket or spanner, and we need to remove the bolts in the lower section of the frame to be able to attach it. These can come quite tight from the factory. I do recommend using a good socket rather than spanner to undo them. Once you've loosened them off, they come out nice and easily by hand. And we will also need to remove the upper bolts with the nuts on to allow us to fit the front bull bar. Once we've removed all the bolts, we are ready to attach our front bull bar. Starting off with the lower bolts, we're going to place them through the bottom section of the bull bar and apply a small quantity of stud lock to them. To start with, only put them in loosely to allow alignment of the bull bar. Once we've loosely put in our lower bolts, we are then able to reattach the upper bolt, push the upper bolts through to align it. Again, we're applying stud lock to these bolts to ensure they do not work loose. Reattach the nuts onto the bolts and tighten fully on all 4 bolts. Our front bull bar, shocks and handlebars and key barrel are all now fully attached onto the bike. We are now going to attach our rear reflector to the quad, which came in our nuts and bolts bag. Remove the nut and the plastic washer from the rear of the reflector, and again apply a small quantity of stud lock to the threads. Once we have applied the small quantity of stud lock, replace the washer onto the reflector and place it through the hole in the centre of the rear of the quad. Reattach your nut onto the back of the reflector, making sure it is nice and square and neat. Do not over tighten the nut on the back of this, as you could snap the reflector. We are now ready to fit our fuel cap and fuel breather pipe. Fit the fuel cap and then push the fuel pipe onto the cap and route it down the front of the fuel tank. We are now ready to fit the handlebar pads to the handlebars. Undo the Velcro to remove the outer section, and then using a pair of scissors carefully and neatly cut a line up the centre of the pad on one side to allow you to slide it over the handlebar. Once you have done this, place it over the top of the handlebar centre section and replace the cover onto the pad. We've now fully assembled our quad and are ready to do a full nut and bolt check on the vehicle, as well as setting the tracking and the brakes. To start our nut and bolt check, we're going to make sure that the front stub axle is correctly tied using an 8 Allen key and a 17mm spanner. Tighten the stub axle bolt until there is no play in the actual stub axle, making sure that it doesn't rock left to right at an angle. Making sure also that you do not over tighten it, as this will cause the steering to become hard for your child or could crush the bearings within the stub axle. Apply stud lock to the bolt on the bottom before we move on to the track rod ends. We are now going to make sure that our front brake caliper is tight using a 5 Allen key. Be careful not to over tighten this, as it is a cast caliper and you could rip the threads out of it. We are now ready to move on to our track rod ends and nose joints, making sure that they are tight. Using a 6 Allen key and a 13 spanner, at the same time we're going to make sure that our front mudguard is aligned correctly. We now need to check that our top shock bolts are tight, as these were pre-fitted in the factory using a 10 socket or spanner and a 13 socket or spanner. We will then check the inner track rod ends to make sure they're tight. And once we have done this, apply stud lock to all the thread ends. Tighten the lower steering column bracket bolts using a 5 Allen key and a 10 spanner. Then using a 17 socket, we're going to tighten the nut at the bottom of the steering column. When we tighten this, we need to be careful that we do not over tighten this nut, as it will cause the steering to become stiff and make it hard for your child to turn the vehicle. We're now going to tighten the swing arm using a 12 and 14 spanner or socket and applying stud lock to the end of the thread once we're happy that this bolt is tight and secure. We will now repeat the process we've just done for the nut and bolt check on the opposite side of the front of the quad. We're now going to make sure that the engine mounting bolts are tight using a 5 Allen key and a 10 spanner. At the same time as checking these bolts, we will check that the outer clutch casing bolts are tight as well. We're now ready to start working over the quad, making sure that all the plastic bolts are tight and secure. Be careful when tightening the plastic bolts that you do not over tighten them, as it is only plastics and you can cause them to crack. Methodically work your way around the quad using a 10 spanner or socket on the back of the bolts to ensure that the nut is not turning. We're now going to make sure our front wheels are tight. You'll need a 17 socket or spanner to tighten them up. Firstly, check there is no side-to-side play in them. If there is, nip the wheel up ever so slightly. If you over tighten the front wheel, you will see it becomes hard to turn. This could cause your bearings to become crushed or overheat and fail. Once you are happy with the tightness, spin the wheel over to make sure it moves freely and has no side-to-side play before applying a small quantity of stud lock onto the end of the threads. We will now repeat the same process on the opposite side of the quad. Holding the rear wheels in our hand and using a 17 socket, make sure it is as tight as possible until the rear wheel starts to turn around within our hand and we can no longer hold it. Once we're happy with it is tight, again apply a small quantity of stud lock to the threads on the outside. Checking our rear chain guard is tight, again being careful not to over tighten our rear chain guard as it is only plastic. We're now going to tighten our rear shock bolt using a 10 and 13 spanner. This was pre-fitted by the factory, but as you can see it is not tight, so it is critical that you make sure it is tightened securely. Checking both the bottom and the top shock bolts. Once it is fully tightened, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. Using a 10 spanner and a 5 Allen key, we're going to make sure the exhaust end can is tight and secure. Again, once we have done this, we will apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We are now ready to make sure the rear swing arm is tight, using a 10 spanner or socket and a 14 spanner or socket. Once it is fully secure, again apply stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now going to make sure the opposite side rear wheel is tight using the 17 spanner or socket, and then apply stud lock to the end of the threads. Check your plastic bolts on this side of the quad using the 5 Allen key and 10 spanner. Again, being careful not to over tighten them, causing the plastics to crack. Tighten the front steering boss using a 10 spanner and a 13 spanner or sockets, making sure that each side is tight and secure to avoid play in the steering boss and steering for your child. Once you have fully tightened them, again apply stud lock to the threads. We're now going to check the front plastic bolts are tight using a 5 Allen key and 10 spanner. We're now going to tip the quad on its side and make sure the engine mounting bolts and the exhaust manifold bolts are tight. You will need a 5 Allen key for this. It is critical that these are tight to avoid vibration in the engine if it is slightly loose, which will go through the quad and it could also crack the engine mounts. Once you have tightened the bottom of the engine, move on to the exhaust manifold. Again, making sure that these are fully tight, as a gap in here can cause exhaust gases to blow out and oil to leak from the engine if it hasn't been burned cleanly, and it will affect performance. We are now ready to level off our brake levers and throttle unit. Obviously you don't want the levers pointing up at an angle where it's uncomfortable for your child to ride the quad. They actually need to be angled slightly downwards. Using a 5 Allen key, loosen off the brake lever and rotate it down to the desired angle so it will be comfortable for your child to ride the bike. Once you are happy with this, retighten the bolt. Do not over tighten these as they are plastic levers and you can cause them to crack. Then using an 8 spanner or socket, loosen off your throttle unit and angle it down so it is in a comfortable position for your child to use while their hand is on the brake at the same time. Retighten it once you are happy and then move over to the opposite side of the quad. Rotate your kill switch around so that it faces the child and they can see exactly where the buttons are on it for stopping the quad. Loosen off your brake lever and angle it down. Looking across from one side to the other, make sure your brake levers are level with each other and at the same angle. Once you are happy that they are at the same angle, retighten the brake lever. We have now fully assembled and nut and bolt checked our quad. We now need to move on to setting the tracking and the brakes on the vehicle. To set the tracking, we will need to loosen off the nuts at the track rods where they attach to the rose joints. One is a left hand thread and one is a right hand thread. By rotating the track rod in the centre, you can see it adjusts the angle of the front wheel so that it either toes in or toes out. The correct position is to make sure that it is perfectly straight with the rear wheels. To do this, stand behind the quad and make sure that your steering is straight, and then look down the straight edge of the back tyre, reach forward to the track rod and adjust it to make sure that the front wheel is in a straight line with the edge of the rear tyre. It is critical that you get the tracking straight on the quad to ensure that the quad handles correctly for your child. It will also help to reduce tyre wear. A very small adjustment on the track rods makes a big difference to the angle the wheel will point at. Once you are happy that the steering is straight, wind the nuts back out towards the rose joints, hold the centre section of the track rod and retighten these nuts. Make sure that these are tightened fully and correctly. If they work loose, it can cause the tracking to go out on the vehicle. We will now repeat the process on the opposite side of the quad. For the purpose of this video, I've already set the opposite side brake. When we set this brake, it is critical that we make sure that both brakes pull and bite at the same point. As the wheels are independent to each other on the front but operate off the same brake lever, if one brake is set sharper than the other, it will cause the quad to pull to the left or the right when your child presses the brakes. The two bolts with the threads on them adjust the outer edge of the brake caliper, allowing you to move that side closer or further away from the disc. Set it so that the brake caliper is as close as possible to the brake disc without touching it. Small adjustments make a big difference on these brake calipers. Once we're happy with the outside edge, we're then going to set the inner edge. We're then going to set the inner pad. Using an 8 spanner and a small Allen key to undo the bolt, we're going to adjust it accordingly to make sure that the brake is set correctly by winding the inner bolt inwards it will move the pad closer to the disc. By winding it out anti-clockwise, it will move it further away from the disc. Once we are happy with the positioning, constantly spinning the wheel and checking on the brake lever itself to make sure that it's pulling correctly, we can tighten up the centre nut. We now need to make sure that both brakes pull at the same point. So raising the front wheels of the quad off the ground or using a maintenance stand as we do, spin both front wheels over and then press the brake lever. Checking that the caliper levers are pulling at the same point and stopping at the same point. Spin the wheels over again and double check to make sure they're pulling equally. We now need to set the rear brake on the quad. This is slightly different, it's a floating brake caliper and there is only the one bolt that we can adjust on it. This pushes the outside pad inwards towards the disc. Again, it wants to be set as close as possible without touching it. Looking down the caliper to the disc to check the gap between the pad and the disc. Adjust the bolt accordingly until you are happy with it, pressing the rear brake as you are going along to ensure that it's not too sharp and just causing the back wheels on the quad to lock up. Hold the Allen key in the centre and then tighten with the spanner to ensure the bolt does not work loose. We are now ready to adjust our chain tension on the quad. Start loosening off the bolts at the top and bottom of both side bearing carriers. Do not undo them fully, only loosen them. You will then use a small Allen key or screwdriver in the holes on the outside of the bearing carrier. As you can see, by rotating the bearing carrier around, which is an oval shape, it moves the back axle closer or further away from the motor, which allows you to tension or loosen the chain. As you set these, make sure you set both sides equally, as it will affect the axle position. Don't just set one side. If these are not set square, the axle will sit in the bike at an angle which will cause the vehicle to pull to the left or the right, and it will also wear your sprockets and chains a lot quicker. Before you tighten anything up, make sure you keep checking your chain tension so that it's at the desired correct attention. Once you're happy with this, retighten the bearing carrier bolts. Make sure you tighten them equally so there's an equal gap at the top and the bottom of the carrier when you tighten them. Tighten up the opposite side bearing carrier, and at the end of this process double check your chain tension to make sure that it is correct. This has been a build video for the FunBikes 49cc mini quad. Many thanks for watching and let the fun begin.